Hello.
Hello. I was looking at
That was my
food there.
my manual
Oh,
on my
fantastic!
desk.
You can talk about that as we go on. That's super brilliant. Alice,
Yeah,
what has been right about today so far for you?
I managed to get all of us fed through the bath and the children in front of cartoons in 55 minutes post swim. So I need an award or a medal or something.
Is that from the moment of leaving the swimming pool as well?
No, from the moment of like entering the house, I was like, right, dinner, bath, we're on a schedule.
How many children have you got?
2, an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old.
Young. Oh, that is super impressive. I have no idea what 8-year-olds and 5-year-olds are like and how difficult they are. But I've been told, I'll know that firsthand, hopefully, in 5 years' time. But yes, okay, super duper. So I'm going to start thinking about obviously introducing you as a worker in the arts. And if I was to describe you, I would use the words artist, writer, curator, researcher, facilitator. Are these all descriptions that you agree with, or how would you describe yourself?
Yep, those pretty much sum it up. It's quite difficult because if you say artist, that might encompass like a wide, broad spectrum of practice. Some people might have an idea of like that kind of studio making, exhibiting type of practice rather than a sort of curatorial type of practice, like cultural producer, writer as well as that. So I think that those different elements, splitting them all up, describe it all kind of coherently, I guess.
Okay, well, do you know what, Alice? This is why I like talking to you, because you've just introduced 2 terms that I feel very ashamed not to know, even though I've been practicing art since I was very So you spoke about a curational producer, and what was the other one? I can't remember what the other one was, but I'd not heard of those terms before. So could you explain firstly what a curational producer is, and also what kind of artist are you in terms of the art that you make?
Did I say cultural producer? I might have said cultural producer.
Maybe that was. You'd said that. Maybe it was something similar to that. I don't know.
I guess producer might be aligned with a curatorial practice. So in a similar sort of way of like bringing things together. I guess it might come from a kind of film and theatre type of industry. So you've got a producer working in that sort of area of work, making stuff happen. And I think because I work across different medium as well, it's difficult to sort of say that like a curatorial practice encompasses like producing a festival, for example, or producing different events and stuff. There doesn't really seem to be a one-size-fits-all kind of description, which is quite interesting in itself, because my practice does span a lot of different medium. So like performance and film. So I generally make objects in a kind of like sculptural, object-based capacity. But then I also make films and work collaboratively a lot of the time as well. So especially working on curatorial projects, festivals and events, I often work with other artists to make stuff happen.
Are you saying, Alice, that you're a lady with fingers in a lot of pies? And I'm sure
a little bit.
I promise I wasn't going to use that metaphor, but there you go. The idea of making things happen is something that's really obvious about you, which is what's great about you, because I've been following you for about, I don't know, maybe it's 2 months now, and you are extremely active on social media, and it's always something different that you're presenting or giving opportunities to the public, and a lot of them around well-being as well, which is really, really nice. The projects which obviously I'm most interested in and that I've enjoyed is your work around the topic of resilience. I was really pleased to get connected to you and to find that you'd been studying this and researching it and talking to artists about it, because this is one of the themes, probably the most important theme in the CVIVArts Theatre project, What Are You Hungry For? So I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you. Could you just, before we home in on the 2 projects, your article writing and your podcast on resilience, could you just talk a little bit about why you wanted, as an artist, to delve into resilience?
So the Resilience is Futile publication that I was writer in residence for, that was a Corridor 8 and YVAM collaboration, who put an open call out that I responded to and was lucky enough to be selected for it. That incorporated mapping out the sector in the visual arts sector in Yorkshire and the Humber. So going and talking to artists about this uncritical term resilience. You know, we're often talked about in the north of being resilient because per capita there's much less funding for the arts. The methodology I used was to invite artist networks that I was either involved in or other people on the team recommended, to go and say to those groups and networks, can you recommend artists that that you consider resilient? However you want to define and describe that. So I didn't predefine and describe that for them. I wanted to know what other artists thought about this term. So from those recommendations, I then invited those artists to speak to me, to have an interview about their practice. So they'd already been peer nominated as resilient, which you know, it was great conversations. You know, what does that mean, and who's recommended them on like what kind of grounds, and just find out, you know, how they work as an artist, both kind of practically and how they juggle it all, how they make it work financially, all those kind of things. And then I wrote the piece for the publication that drew out commonalities, but it was very much focused on each individual practice with a kind of conclusion summary at the end of it. And then off the back of that, with the work I do with Dwell Time, which is an artist-led organisation with Vanessa Haley and Lenny Schramer, we were invited to revisit those artist interviews and do the Dwell a While podcasts as a Dwell Time YVAN collaboration. So that's how the podcast came about, by doing a follow-up interview with the artists that were able and willing to participate in that, about how things had been, particularly post or in the middle of the pandemic. We recorded them back in sort of August, September, October last year. So we'd already been in this COVID pandemic for quite a while. And how does that like affect artists? How does the term resilient still kind of, you know, how they respond to that idea and stuff like that. So that's how those kind of projects came into fruition.
Fantastic. There's loads there. The first thing that I want to say is that the reason why I enjoyed listening to Dwell a While by Dwell Time, which you co-founded, podcast, I enjoyed listening to those because I think as an artist, it can be very, very isolating. And I was actually discussing this on Geraldine's here now on the fantastic workshop that she hosted yesterday. We were talking about how do you self-manage yourself if you're a facilitator or you're running an arts project, and then it can be a very self-isolating thing. So what was nice was to listen to those and hear all the different ways that they manage and that they get through. And there were so many different ways and different priorities by the artists about how they manage and actually how useful they think the term resilience is. And you said that at the beginning when you were saying that great stuff there, that you said that what their ideas were about resilience, and that they had different approaches to this term resilience. Did you find that anybody had any negative views of the term resilience, that they'd rather forget it? Or was there a number of different feelings about this term and how important it was? Just going to grab my tea.
I think because I was very much focused on the artist's practice and then how they describe their practice as almost defining that term without too much heavy emphasis on the word itself. It was a kind of it was like a different way of defining that for the artist. They had different responses to being called resilient. Some artists were a bit sort of taken aback of like, I don't understand why somebody thinks I'm resilient. It doesn't necessarily match with their idea of the term and how they experience stuff. So that was a really interesting idea that came out of the interviews. And there was also some opinions of resilience being a kind of like one size fits all, or almost like a corporate word that's maybe used by funders, by like the art industry, that doesn't really correlate very well to actually kind of, you know, artist-led practice, collaborative practice. But with the interviews, I tried to steer away from how they defined the term and more concentrated on how they define their practice. And by doing that, it was defining it on their terms, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Absolutely. So they, in a way, by focusing on the priorities of their practice, or the kind of practitioner they want to be, they were surviving and meeting tasks ahead, I suppose, more successfully, because that's what resilience is. And do you know what? I'm going to turn to my sheet now. I'm going to turn to my sheet now, Alice, and I'm going to read out the definition of the term resilience. So, looking at the dictionary definition, it says the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. The capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, and I get an uneasy feeling when I think about that. Just to say really quickly, so if I'm in a school, I've been in various schools, and I see posters on the wall saying "Be resilient," and you have, you know, PHSE lessons, and the students are taught how to be resilient, and it makes me feel a little bit uneasy, and I get a sense that the students also feel a little bit uneasy, because it's like this pressure of like, you must hit things head on, you must face problems with a particular speed. And I think, blimey, you know, what if people want to take their time over it? You know, art is about processes, and life should be about experimenting. So what about experimenting on your approach towards meeting challenges? And what about if it's okay to feel not great for a while? How do you feel about the term resilience? Do you think it's important, and how have you been resilient in your practice? So just focus on you for a while.
I think the term needs to have a very sort of person-centric element to it, because it's not like you get a kind of Scouts badge for being resilient, and that's like because you tick so many different criteria. It's interesting with this course that I've just done, this mental health first aider course, with the Mental Health Foundation Association in England, because they talk about resilience in mental health terms, and it's the individual's ability to cope with whatever life throws at them, and that isn't a static ability. It depends on lots of different factors at one particular time, and I think that can be that way of looking at things can also be applicable in artistic practice as well, when we're talking about resilience. So an artist's ability to be resilient at any particular time depends on lots of different factors, like the support network, whether they've got enough income, all those different factors that sustain practice, and also some sort of intrinsic element like personality, or, you know, whether it's like some sort of life experience, how long they've been practicing. And it's not just something that we can be like, yeah, tick, we're resilient because we meet some criteria kind of thing like that. And for myself, I think that the idea of being resilient is because I have lots of different things in my practice. It's not, so for example, through COVID, I was able to adapt my practice and concentrate on the things that were like survivable through the pandemic. So, you know, you can't run workshops with community face to face, so obviously that was off. But, you know, I'm lucky enough to have a studio in the shed in my back garden, so I could still have a studio practice, and that's a bit of kind of luck rather than anything else really. You just happen to have that set up. But having a kind of multidisciplinary practice and an adaptable approach seems to be, especially with the interviews I was doing with the other artists, it seems to be a kind of common thread for people being able to navigate certain difficulties, is having a not necessarily a reactive practice, but an adaptable one, which is responsive to certain situations, whether that's being given an opportunity that they can respond to, or something like a negative, not necessarily negative, but a challenge like the pandemic. Artists have survived in various different ways and found different coping strategies through it by being adaptable, which I think is quite common for artists to be. So yeah, that's kind of quite interesting how like people have navigated through COVID. That's something that like we're quite interested in with Dwell Time and Wyvan as well.
That's fantastic. So what you're saying, just before I just move on, I'm just going to say, if anybody's got a question, please put your questions in the comment box and we will go through and Alice will answer your questions for you. Absolutely. Hello to everybody. Kathy Seabreen is saying that she's new to Insta Live and can't hear us. I'm so sorry. I don't think I can do anything from this end. I would say have a look at your speaker, have a little fiddle about, Kathy, and then come back to us, and I'll have a look myself after this Instagram Live and see if it's anything that I can do for the next one that we do. Okay, just to returning back to this idea of adaptability, so it sounds like to me quite a positive thing. Obviously, nobody wanted COVID to happen, but because COVID has happened, we've been in situations where some things have been cut off. So that has meant that we've had to find other doors that can be open, and in doing that we've experimented with new ideas, and that's kept us sort of thriving, using a term that you use in your paper. That's kept people going, and also developing the art practice and the art experiences of that artist, and therefore shaping them as an artist, and therefore shaping their resilience, because it sounds like the resilience is hand in hand with being an artist. And it also sounds like it's not something that was conscious to the artists that you interviewed. Sounds almost like they'd not really considered the idea of them being resilient before, or resilience. So do you think it is important that people think about resilience consciously and work on this and explore methods from people? Or would you say it's okay to not even consider this term?
I don't know if considering the term itself is necessary, but I think thinking about how maybe we could talk about in terms of like how sustainable practice is, which is something that I think a lot of artists, and probably all artists, do, how they can sustain their practice, how they can continue to practice as artists, which I think, sustainability, resilience, they're sort of similar, samey things. Not many artists are in a very privileged situation to not have to consider how they're going to pay the bills, or how they're going to continue having if they want a public interface. So I think that continuation of practice and wanting to develop and progress is something that, from my experience, artists do anyway. And I think there's this idea of going from surviving to thriving. It's talked a lot about in terms of mental health. Whether you're just surviving, you can like literally just feed yourself and manage to keep a roof over your head, the bare basics, or are you thriving and enjoying life? And I think you can use those kind of ideas with practice as well. Are you just surviving as an artist, or are you thriving and making new work, stuff that excites you, getting new opportunities and stuff like that? And I think it comes down to having a reflexive, self-reflective practice that I think most artists do, from my experience. And I think what's also really critical is having a peer support network. We were talking about in terms of isolation and working in isolation. I think lots of people struggle with that, not just on a sort of personal mental health basis, but also on a practice basis. It's really useful for a lot of artists to get feedback and to talk about ideas and stuff. And that's one thing that's really come out of one of the projects that I run, Art Lab, which pre-pandemic it was based at Dean Club in Halifax, and it moved online, and we do it on Zoom every month. And having that space for artists to talk with each other about their own practice and about ideas has been really valuable when there's been very little other options to do that, with social distancing and everything being closed. So I think that integral to resilience and thriving as an artist, we need other artists around us. I think that those peer support networks are invaluable.
Absolutely. I was saying yesterday to Geraldine and her colleagues that we were talking about how do we continue. I think I mentioned this previously, but the thing that stands out to me is being able to speak to somebody who's been in the journey a couple of steps before, or is experiencing what I'm experiencing at that moment. Because sometimes I think artists sometimes can be incredibly self-critical, and one of the first things that you can think is, especially with art, when you're trying to do something different, and there is a tendency for audience members of whatever art to first of all criticize it and try to understand it. And I think sometimes that process of understanding new art, sometimes criticism and judgment comes in. So I think that artists are very brave. But what I tend to do is sort of look at myself and say, oh, something's gone wrong. You know, one of my actors is upset. This is my fault. I've done something wrong. But actually to speak to other people, to 3 or 4 people who've experienced the same thing and said, oh, no, I made that mistake as well. No, that's fine. You know, you're not doing anything wrong. Or a mentor or a supervisor that said, that's completely usual. That's completely natural. So I think this idea of speaking to other people is absolutely, it normalizes it and it makes it feel okay. So you're talking about Art Lab, and just to pick up on very briefly before we move on, is there any kind of let me think if I'm using the right word here, prerequisite? Like I'm trying to be posh. I'll look in the dictionary afterwards and look at the definition of resilient and gone, prerequisite wasn't the word that I wanted to use. But is there any kind of, do you have to have a certain practice to be able to join on Art Lab, a certain amount of experience? Yeah, can you talk about that?
Yeah, so no, it's open to any stage a career for artists, whether they want to call themselves artists or whether they want to call themselves performers, practitioners. It's got a very sort of heavy visual arts element to it, but that's not exclusive. So if somebody has presented poetry before, for example, and performance. So it's very much rooted in the visual arts, but then like multidisciplinary practice really. And we've had artists come and talk who haven't gone through formal education, that are like self-taught. So there's no like criteria prerequisite for artists. There's no like screening process either. So it's not particularly a curated program. It's very much like if you want a slot, then you book it in at the next available slot, which suits the artist. And I usually have 2 or 3 presenters at a time, and those I kind of really like the serendipity of who presents on the night. So it's not, oh, I'll pick 2 artists that have a similar practice or there's a common thread, but it's really nice seeing those things emerge if they do. They'll be like, oh, those 2 practices maybe have like a kind of narrative around this or use material in a similar sort of way, and that's not a curated thing, that's just literally a serendipity type of thing, which is lovely to see. So yeah, there's no prerequisite for either attending as like audience or as presenting. And what's nice about, one of the things I like about Art Lab as well, is that everybody's invited to ask questions and participate in the discussion. So it's not a kind of how would I say this, like potentially if you go to a lecture, you've got somebody giving a lecture in a position of knowledge or authority, like imparting knowledge to the audience. It's more of a sort of sharing practice and asking the audience to give back as well. And they're often artists of various different stages in their career that might make suggestions or just generally give like peer support. So it does just feel like a sort of like mutual support group in a way, or just that kind of less hierarchy of a kind of formal lecture type of thing.
That sounds perfect. It's not fixed and it's for everybody. And I like the idea of serendipity, like chance operations. Everybody loves chance operations. Sometimes the best things come out of chance operations and things, improvisation, things that you weren't expecting. That's super duper. I'm going to go to my questions again. All these things I thought to ask you, you're answering them so well. Right, okay. Do you know what? Before we move on from the paper and the interviews, I just wanted to get, I wondered if you could identify a few things that the interviewees had said that had helped them develop their practice. I know we've spoken about other people. Is there anything else that they said sort of helps them in their journey to surviving and continuing to be an artist?
Yeah, I think we touched upon it earlier, and it's basically being around other artists. So whether it was one artist talked about the locality that she worked in being really critical to her sort of sustainability and resilience, and having in a very small location access to lots of other artists that she could just bump into at the shops or, you know, arrange a coffee meetup or something like that. Another artist talked about collaboration and also serendipity, actually, being really critical to his practice. And also this idea, I mentioned it in the conclusion as well, about like a non-expectant generosity, like not expecting an immediate reciprocal exchange. So this idea of giving a little bit to the sector or to a specific person, you know, helping them out, advising them, lending them some tools, whatever it might be, and not necessarily expecting a direct exchange, but this idea of like you give a little bit to your community or the art sector as a whole, and then like hope something comes back, but not expect it in a way. And there's another artist that talked about his collective studio practice being really important. And again, it's about being around other artists. So it seems to be absolutely key for many artists to have that. And that access, where mainly, I mean, I did those Resilience Disputelle interviews before the pandemic, so it was very much talking about like in-person meetups. So yeah, that kind of idea of how do we navigate that when in-person wasn't possible was really interesting. Yeah, I think definitely that was like the common strong theme was other artists being around them.
I think the idea of sharing and share alike is definitely a communal thing, and actually it nurtures character and it nurtures the mutual respect. And actually, if I'm teaching a drama lesson, I'm sure that I'm like, I can't believe I'm saying it again, but I'm saying it again. But I stand in front of a class and say, number one, the most important thing about the drama space is mutual respect. And I have this huge belief that arts can make a person. For those, maybe it's because we have to be more resilient, so we have to support each other more. I don't know, maybe there's something about the characteristics of being an artist, and the bravery of being an artist, and the reliance on other people. For example, if you're performing, you need an audience. These characteristics of being an artist that push us to need other people and need that mutual support from other people. So I believe it can. This is why I love the arts. But you're verifying what I say, that it can really make a person, if you approach the arts properly, it can make a really nurturing person. And it's clear that the artists that you interviewed had those qualities, that idea of sharing and sharing alike. I'm just thinking about the two artists that you interviewed with the studio space, and the idea that during lockdown they minimized the cost of the rent for people that were using their studio space, just so that they could survive. And as soon as they got some grant back, then they gave the money back to them, because they just wanted to survive themselves. And I was like, oh, and I was gardening, listening to Dwell a while, listening to all these different artists saying, oh, that's amazing that you're doing that. It's a completely, you know, a selfless act. Yeah, it was really interesting to listen to. Again, for anybody that wants to listen to the podcast, a really nice listen to them when you're gardening, when you're in the bath. It's a real insight about the journey of being a sculptor, or the journey of being a visual artist, or the journey of running a studio. And the details for those podcasts are in the last CVIVArts post. And you can, of course, see Alice's information on our website, and you can follow her and find all the wonderful work that she does. I'm just going to have a look now at something that I wrote down about one of the approaches that I liked best. I can't actually find it, but I remember it, that one of the artists spoke about, he supposes that, obviously I'm paraphrasing, that the way he managed to be resilient was not compromising his integrity. So just continuing to do things the instinctual way that he does things, and not considering public opinion too much. Obviously I'm paraphrased this, so this is my understanding, and I hope I've not turned it into a misconception as I processed it. I wanted to ask you, Alice, because I find the art that you make really interesting, and I would probably say to somebody it was conceptual art, and please correct me when you talk about your art in a minute. But I also want to know if you've thought about that idea of balancing personal integrity with what you think people want to see. How much do you consider audience of art when creating your own work? That's
a really interesting question. I think with my studio practice and the objects I make, I'm mindful that they might be obviously viewed by other people and what that communicates. But I am very much about looking about the integrity of the object itself and about how that functions as if it's a sculpture, for example, or, you know, a video, how that operates as an integral piece of artwork. But then I suppose with the more sort of curatorial practice and the collaborations that I do, then the audience is like much more at the forefront of my mind. So I think there might be a little bit of a division there, or a little bit of a like distinction between making objects and then producing or curating. But then because I make objects for an audience, that audience, the idea of an audience is never kind of absent. So I'm always thinking about how it might communicate, especially if people don't have knowledge of certain aspects. And I think that's why I work with everyday objects quite a lot in my sculptures, because people do have some understanding of, you know, a pencil or a mop and what they do as objects. So like playing around with the structure of them and how they become a dysfunctional object. People already have an understanding usually of what they should have done. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does, and it gives me lots of other questions. Alice, I'm going to sip my tea for a minute. Alice, have you got a hot beverage?
No, I've got some lemonade.
Oh, okay. I don't feel like I can chat without a hot beverage. To me, it's just like a conversation with tea just comes into one. So I just pop it down on the floor there. That's really interesting. And you say that how much you consider the audience, depending on whether you're curating, depending on whether you're working with objects and doing your own work, depending on whether you're doing a film, that consideration of the audience shifts. I don't know whether it's a conscious thing that you consider before you approach these separate projects, which I suppose you can tell us in a minute. But I found really interesting then that you were saying that about the objects that you work with. It sounds like you find that that they make the decision about how much they are for the audience, and they almost sounds like they're kind of let me think of a comparison. I'm thinking of Tom Waits, and he said, "You don't find the song finds you." So almost like you've personified the object and you've allowed it to have its own life and decide what it's going to be. So therefore, because it's deciding what it's going to be, then you can impose the idea of a specific way of thinking on it from a specific demographic. Is that right?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element of that. The kind of object characteristics, not exactly speak for themselves, but they sort of have in a little bit of an anthropomorphic way. They sort of have a character that I like work with in a sense. But there's a project that I do called the Museum of Contemporary Rubbish that is looking very much at rubbish objects. And through the development of that project, I became really interested in why people were discarding these objects. So not necessarily thinking too much about audience, but it was more about like object provenance in a way. So I did a project at the Brighouse Recycling Centre for Brighouse Festival. I can't remember what year it was now, a couple of years ago, where people that were putting objects into the waste stream, I would not necessarily intercept the objects, it was more take a photograph of them and do like a mini interview about why they were throwing them away. So that narrative about why they were no longer used and becoming a discarded object became really important to the way I decided to show the photographs and develop that work. So it's very much about kind of not necessarily the historical narrative of something, but it's becoming like that is important as well. I worked a lot with like ready-made objects that were sort of like off the shelf. But then moving through like my practice, I started becoming much more interested in things that had much more history, like rubbish. So that was definitely a kind of progression and a bit of a change. And that history, and there was stuff I'm working with now as well. The Ollocks sculpture that you've been showing.
I like that. I was looking for the bee, Alice, I've got to be honest. I thought I'd find a bee somewhere, sort of maybe hidden within it. But that was just.
I've got the bees in my studio. Yeah, I've got the bees in my studio. that came from a studio where there was a laser cutting machine, a workshop even rather than a studio, but and that they were the offcuts or like the leftovers from somebody's like laser cutting project, and it did have the bee. I think it was, I can't remember what the initial thing was that was laser cut out. So what the sculpture was made out of was the sort of the negative that they didn't need. And they were like, so I didn't get them laser cut. Someone else got them laser cut for another project. I just collected their waste and made a whole new thing out of it. So there was definitely, again, back to like serendipity of, you know, what comes out of other studios, other artist practice that's waste. And like working with that as well. Like those objects come with, those objects come with a narrative attached to them that we might not know the full history, but we can assume, or I could disclose some of that if I know it as well. So those things are really interesting as well for me at the moment.
So in a sense, a piece missing for the viewer, for the watcher, for the analyzer of the artwork, for them to fill in the dots or to wonder or to keep guessing.
Yeah. And I think it varies. Sorry.
No, so go on.
I think it varies, like work on work, whether like the full sort of historical narrative of the object and like the provenance of the rubbish, for example, whether that is really important to the piece and whether it's shown alongside the piece or incorporated into the work, or whether there's more room left for the audience to fill in the gaps. I think the degree of history that's shared or presented in or with the work varies piece on piece as well, depending on what it is and what I'm working with as well.
This sounds clever, so it does sound conceptual. This is something that I haven't encouraged yet with my practice. This idea of shifting things around to suggest a different purpose or a different narrative or different ideas to an audience member. The thing that comes to my mind is when you was talking about the Olix piece, I was thinking about how you can inject the concept of resilience inside a piece of artwork. And how, if resilience is to face things head on, that everybody has to do. Sometimes you're forced into situations of resilience. Sometimes you choose to put yourself in there. Maybe that's another art piece. But how do you involve resilience in a piece of art so that people can say, this is about struggle, this is about trying? And I felt like the Olix piece, with the repetition, this thing of keep and going. Do you feel like, even though you may have not consciously done it, because it sounds like it's a bit of a free flow process for you and they speak themselves, have you had pieces of artwork actually speak this concept of resilience, even though you've not planned to put it inside the artwork?
It's funny that you draw that out of the Olix piece, because I think I made that piece in the pandemic quite early on, and it was about this kind of spiraling, like going round and round, but not in a complete circle because it physically spirals like that. And it wasn't directly a piece made about resilience, but it was obviously something that I was thinking about struggling to maintain a practice alongside homeschooling 2 young kids by myself, and then, you know, juggling, you know, paid employment and all these kinds of things. So in a way, that piece unintentionally possibly became about resilience. And just this kind of flippant, like, oh, Olix, it's not going very well, is it?
Well, if you know, I mean, I know some people disagree with this. I've had a lot of conversations about this in the past, but if art is cathartic and if art is therapeutic, I know there are some people believe that individuals who are prone to stress or prone to not being resilient go into art because they need a foil, they need therapy to be able to learn about themselves and search themselves and then to express themselves. This is one of the ideas that's come up. So I suppose, if is art then is it the practice is it the doing that's the doing? Is it the doing that's the important thing? So is there a suggestion for people to just play and just do, and actually reveal yourselves to yourselves, and reveal yourself and how resilient you are, so learn about yourself through art, rather than trying to train yourself to be resilient through meditation, or train yourself to be resilient through I'm trying to think of other examples, speaking to yourself in the mirror every day and going, you are resilient, you can do this, you can do this. That was the only example. I've never done that. I've never looked at I have you're a tiger, you're a tiger. No, I haven't. I did look in the mirror before this chat and just go, come on, crack on. I got back from work and I was like but do we then advocate? And again, I know you're the type of person to say, well, it's not up to me, because you're so free in your thinking, but would you maybe suggest somebody to try just the act of doing rather than the act of conscious trying, conscious decision making?
Yeah, I think that playful, playing is really important. So enjoying something, having fun, playing around with materials, those things, they can have really therapeutic effects as well. Just, getting your hands into clay or paint or whatever it is, and messing around without necessarily having a kind of like preformed idea of what something's going to turn into. Just like, let's see what happens, experimental type of practices. I think those could be really freeing. And like certainly in the first lockdown, I did quite a lot of that. I did a lot of drawing and just playing around. And I think that probably saved my sanity quite well. Of just trying out new things without an agenda. And I do think that there is a therapeutic quality in that. Whether it's playing around with art materials or playing around with a musical instrument or whatever people are doing or want to do or want to try out new things, I think there's definitely benefits in certainly for mental health and certainly therapeutic. When Dwell Time run workshops, we have a framework and a structure, so we're suggesting certain ways of doing something, but we just like play around, have fun. There's no right or wrong way to do this. And running workshops in schools as well, pre-pandemic, I was running Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 workshops, and it was really, it shocked me actually the way that the kids were like, what do I have to do? Like, tell me how I do A, B and C. And I was like, just play, just have fun, be creative. Like, how do I be creative? Tell me how to do it step by step. And it's so I have, primary school age, primary school kids myself. So I kind of get like that age group in a way. But it did shock me that it was like, how do you prescribe creativity? How do you say, like, not in a social prescribing way, in a more sort of like teaching way? How do you say be creative? I think, it is that like letting loose of expectations and saying, just play. We seem to have lost this, especially in like, with the national, or I could say very negative things about the national curriculum. Let's just say that.
That's a whole other
I know, that's another podcast, isn't it? That's another whole conversation. But, even applicable to adults as well. Maybe, we've worked with, Dwell Time have worked with people before who haven't necessarily written poetry or done any of the workshop the type of activities we do in workshops for a while, and we had a really powerful experience with one workshop member who we were doing cut up poetry, and poetry inspired from a couple of different pieces, and she was really reluctant, like saying, I haven't written poetry since high school, and I think she was like 50, 60 or something like that. I haven't written anything. I wrote one poetry at school, and this is like my second piece or third piece of poetry I've ever written. And we were like, just go for it. It doesn't have to rhyme. It doesn't have to make sense. Sometimes the ones that don't make a literary sense are like the best ones. Just have a go. And it was amazing. And we published it. It was just lovely. And for us to kind of be in that privileged situation of enabling somebody to do something that they didn't feel like they were good at or that they wanted to participate in because it was othered. I don't write poetry because I've only written one and it's not for me. That was, for us, it was like, that was such a great experience to facilitate somebody writing something that we then published. And hopefully had a positive impact on, you know, mental health and, you know, self-esteem and all those important things. So yeah, playing, having fun, absolutely important.
It's a beautiful thing when when somebody does some, when it, almost like people feel like they need a confidence to be able to, or the right or the confidence to be able to just do some automatic writing, or just start writing just what they're feeling at that moment, because it might not be good enough, and they self-judge. But actually, yeah, that does sound like a beautiful thing. So I don't know what the parameters were that for her to. It sounds like the only rules that were in place, and like you say, you just facilitate kind of like a framework, and then, you know, simple rule, and then the creativity could come. But it sounded like a simple framework, and the confidence, and you inbuilt the confidence, and there you go. It's unleashed. It's all there. It is really interesting to me that younger children need a starting point, or need a scaffolding, or a suggestion about how to do a certain type of play. Because I mean, I always say to my drama students, well, I had a class today in supply teaching, and I said, why is it called a play? Because it's about playing, and we're going to do some children's games. All the best drama games come from children's games. You know, it is, and it's something that they do naturally. And it feels sometimes when you're creating that you're trying to find that that embodied sort of child of the self, that wasn't worried and wasn't stressed, and is just feeling the beauty and the authenticity of just creating and seeing what comes, because it's in those improvised moments sometimes that actually, wow, look at that, when, you know, when I didn't have that mind on somewhere else, this is the thing that can come out of me, and more can come out of me. I went on a little bit of a rant there, Alice, I'm sorry. But
it made total sense though, yeah.
It brings to mind authenticity. And again, I'm gone completely away from the questions that I because you're speaking and you're making me think of what I want to ask. Authenticity, that's something that came to mind when you were speaking about that lady and that poem. It sounds to me that was probably an authentic piece of work, because you hadn't told her how to do it, so she wasn't playing to anybody else's rules. She was just encouraged to do what she felt at the time, and there you go. It's an authentic, it's a true, and it's a trite response, and that's beautiful, and it's really individual. That's something that's really important to me. Could you talk about what's important that people do see in your art? Is it authenticity, or is there something else that you'd like to be recognized for in your art?
I think it's about having like a resonance. So I think this is why I collaborate a lot as well, because it's like having that connection with people, and, you know, making something together that we both, all three of us, you know, however many people are working on a project, that it all makes sense for us. So going back to the idea of using everyday materials that people have an idea about, that they have like, you know, a relationship with, you know, they might hate the mop, they might love the pencil, whatever it is. If they see the work and have a resonance with what I've done to it, and it's like speaking to them, if for want of a better way of describing it, then that's something that like is an intention, or something that I enjoy through making artwork. Is that people, it's not exactly getting it, like it's a one-liner, although I'm quite keen on the one-liners actually. You know, the idea of fun.
What do you mean by one-liner, Alice?
You know jokes.
I'm genuinely.
Well, you know how you get jokes that are one-liners? Do you know what I mean?
Okay.
One-liner jokes. Okay, I can't think of one off the top of my head. I'm not a joke teller.
I'm going to come to Geraldine's comment in a minute, but one-liners that are like jokes. I'll tell a really dirty joke. A man fell in a bag of soap. That's not one-liner, is it? It's just a really bad joke. I don't know. Have you got any examples? No,
you put me on the spot now. I don't know any jokes. Have suddenly all gone out of my head.
If you've got one-liner, there's people that watch it. If you want to pop it in the comment box.
Yeah, one-liners in the comments, please.
but you don't mind your art sometimes being one-liners, as long as it's a provocation. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think humour's really important, which I suppose what made me think of the one-liner analogy is if it's funny in some way, even if it's like, you know, through humor, I guess like absurd might be a form of humor. I quite like absurd things, so like, you know, drawing on surrealism and surrealist practices. I've got an example of a piece of work that I made that was considered a one-liner. I made it at uni.
Okay,
I melted a pint glass, you know, like just a sort of regular pint glass in the kiln, so that it just slumped, and I called it a flat pint. And my tutor at the time was like, that's a one-liner, in a sculpture. And I kind of toured it around bars and took photographs of it and waited to see how the bar staff would interact when they were coming collecting glasses. And they'd like look at it and be a bit like, should I you know, pick it up? And that would be an example of a kind of like one-liner piece of artwork. And I think it comes down to the titling of the work. You know, it's a flat pint. It's like literally a flat pint. So I suppose that's where the one-liner analogy comes from, in the kind of joke sense. But, you know, me and my friends had like a great time laughing about this sculpture in the pub. And some of the bar staff did take it away, and it was like, oh, should I go and retrieve it, or should I like let that situation happen? Because they just picked it up like it was just like, oh, it's just the glass has somehow managed to melt itself in the bar. They didn't even kind of like, you know, no sort of like a flicker of disconcert or whatever. Just like, oh, we need to take that with the rest of the dead pints.
Oh, they didn't realise the fullness of the situation. If it's you described it as an analogy, this flat pint. So of course, some pieces of artwork, some abstract works are metaphors for something bigger. I'm just thinking about the brick square and how that's sort of a metaphor for. To be honest, I've discussed about what that might be a metaphor for. So building bricks in life, or kind of not being able to break through things. But so this pint maybe was an analogy for sometimes life is flat, and actually, if somebody took it away, does that mean? I don't know. Has that got a positive ending to the piece of artwork?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, where's it going to end up?
Yeah,
got a new lease of life.
Yeah, and send it around the world and see how people interact with it, and you know, how do they have resilience with the flat pint? Do they drink it head on, or do they push it to the end of the table? So yeah. There you go. There's the endless possibilities, and actually what we're sort of seeing, or what I'm noticing, is that resilience is weaving through everything, because it's unavoidable. Like it's unavoidable, particularly for artists. It's unavoidable for anybody, especially now. But we can cite it anywhere that we want to cite it, definitely. But what you've discussed is the idea maybe of not citing it and not putting the pressure on thinking about it, or approaches to deal with resilience, but actually to just do, because maybe it's encompassed, that's another word I'm not sure I'm using correctly, within us to be able to deal with resilience well. So I'm just thinking about, like, you know, in breathing practice in physical theatre, there's a lot of practitioners that believe if you focus on the breath, you become tensed, but if you focus on imagination and the body, your breath flows really easily. So there you go, that's my analogy for dealing with resilience. Don't put the onus on resilience, and then you have the ability to be a really resilient person yourself. That's super interesting and exciting. I'm just going to have a look now at the time. Oh, I've just looked at the time. Oh my gosh, I thought we'd be speaking.
That went so fast.
If anybody's got a last minute question, please put it in now. I'm just going to run through where you can find Alice's work, and to the plethora of work she's done. A lot of projects, a lot of opportunities for people to get involved in. If you go to the CVIVArts website and click on What Are You Hungry For, which is a project that I'm doing at the moment with my theatre company, and scroll down to live chats, you'll see Alice's details. My website details are on the CVIVArts link in bio, so you can get Alice's details that way. If you go to the last post that we did on the CVIVArts account, you'll be able to see Alice's links to Alice's project Dwell Time, where she speaks to artists. It's an incredible insight. It makes you feel better as an artist. It makes you feel like you're part of a community, which is something that we touched upon a lot. And you will also see the details for her article, Surviving or Thriving, which is a contribution to the Corridor 8.co.uk. Resilience is Futile publication. It's all interesting. Life is challenging and life is hard. And reading these writings and these podcasts make you feel better. And it gives you some ideas and some approaches and nurtures you to find your own way to be resilient and realise that you are resilient. So yeah, I'm a bit passionate about this now, Alice. Have you got thank you, Donna G. Coleman. I've not really spoken to her, but Alice, it would be great to catch up somehow soon. That's from Kathy.
It would, Kathy. I went to uni with Kathy. Kathy probably remembers the Flat Pint as well. We haven't seen each other for years and years.
Super duper. Living flesh, she's seen the Flat Pint. I can only imagine. Have you got any final thoughts, Alice?
I mean, just picking up on what you were summarising there about this term resilience and maybe not focusing on it too much. I think that as a sort of not very tangible term, you know, if we're trying to strive for something that isn't tangible, how are we going to necessarily achieve it if it's not so tangible? And just like doing what we do that's fun and enjoyable and makes sense to us and gives us a sort of sense of well-being, you know, hopefully some form of income. I know that's a bit of a contentious thing at the moment with the current situation, but you know, just doing it like you say, and rather than trying to be something that we don't necessarily know what that is because it's not a concrete thing. And also this comparative stuff that sometimes we can get into, it's definitely rife in like motherhood, but I think it's also true in artists as well. Like we're always, not always, that's not true, but there's a tendency sometimes to look at what other people are doing and compare what we're doing. But we're individuals, aren't we? You know, we're so individual and we do things, we might do something similar to other people, which is great, and we can share and learn and stuff. But how we do it is absolutely unique, and, you know, it's going to be different to how other people do it because it's very much individual and about our individual self. So being resilient is individual, absolutely individual to ourselves. And I'll resist waffling on more. I think that's a good point to end it on.
It is a very good point. And I'm going to use that quote about it being not being tangible. So how can we strive for it when it's not tangible? And I also love the idea about individuality, but knowing that people can advise and be there for you while you find your own journey. Oh, it's lovely. And I feel very spiritual. I just want to say a big thank you to everybody who joined on. This is a recording that it's going to be on the CVIVArts Instagram for you to listen to anytime, but it's also going to be on YouTube as well. So it's going to have a permanent base. So if you want to come back to it and have coffee with us again in your own time, then you can. But thank you very much for listening. Alice, thank you.
Thank you.
See you again in the future.
Maybe in person, you never know.
Oh, no. Thank you so much, and I bid you farewell.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone that's joined.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.